You ever feel like you're being watched? Not in the usual sense, like someone's standing behind you, but something bigger. Something that doesn't have eyes, but still sees every move you make. That's how it felt that night. It started simple enough. My dog, Max, wouldn't stop barking. We just moved into this place, a rental cabin tucked into the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat after the mess of my divorce. Quiet, solitude, a fresh start. Except Max didn't seem to get the memo. Every night, like clockwork, he'd start barking at the back door around 3 a.m. Nothing I did would calm him down. I figured it was wildlife, maybe a raccoon or deer. But on the fourth night, I decided to check for myself. The woods were eerily silent as I stepped onto the porch, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything out of place. No glowing eyes in the trees, heck, no rustling in the underbrush. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the ground. A symbol. It was drawn in the dirt, a circle with jagged lines intersecting it. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, a kid's idea of a joke. But out here, who would even bother? Max growled low beside me, his hackles up. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and for the first time I realized how quiet it was. No insects, no wind. "All right, boy, let's go back inside," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. But as I turned, I heard it. A whisper. I froze. The voice was faint, like someone murmuring just out of reach. "Help me." It was so soft, so desperate. I whipped the flashlight around, my heart hammering. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Just the whisper again, this time closer. "Please, help me." I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, back ready to call the police, but there was no signal. Figures. Max wouldn't stop pacing, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Stress. Isolation. But deep down I knew better. That symbol in the dirt wasn't random. The next morning, I went out to check again. The symbol was gone, not erased or faded, just gone, like it had never been there. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty spot. That's when I noticed the second one. It was deeper in the woods, etched into the bark of a tree. The same jagged circle, but this one looked older, weathered. Max refused to follow me any farther, so I turned back. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me all day. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispering started again, faint but insistent. This time it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound to the basement door. It was cracked open, a sliver of darkness yawning beneath. I hadn't opened that door since moving in. The realtor had mentioned the basement was unfinished, prone to flooding and basically unusable. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped. I should have left right then and there. But something pushed me forward, down the creaking stairs into the cold, damp basement. The air was heavy, smelling of mildew and earth. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move across the far wall. And then I saw it. Another symbol. This one was carved into the concrete floor, larger and more intricate than the others. In the center of the circle sat an object, a rusted metal box. I don't know what possessed me to open it. Curiosity, maybe. Or something darker. Inside was a photograph. It was old, sepia-toned, and slightly warped from age. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl standing in front of a cabin. This cabin. But their faces were wrong. The eyes were scratched out, deep gouges marring the paper. My hands were shaking as I put the photo back, but before I could close the box, I heard it again. "Help me." The whisper was louder now, echoing through the basement. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. I was plunged into darkness. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls. The only response was a low, guttural laugh. And then, a single word, "Mine." I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. Max was barking like crazy, his paws scratching at the front door. I didn't even bother grabbing my keys. I just threw open the door and ran, Max at my heels. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the woods. When I finally turned back, the cabin was dark, silent. But in the window, I saw a face. It was the little girl from the photograph, and she was smiling. I never went back. Sometimes I wonder if someone else moved in, if they heard the whispers too. But mostly I just try to forget. Not that it matters. because every so often, late at night, I hear it again. Help me. You ever go somewhere that feels wrong? Like the air's too heavy, the shadows too deep, and even though it's quiet, you feel like the place is alive, waiting? Yeah, that's exactly what I walked into last month. I had no business being there. Let me start with that. It was an old house, way out in the country, left to me by my uncle when he passed. I hadn't seen the guy in years, but apparently he'd left everything to me. His attorney said it wasn't much, just a dilapidated farmhouse and a few acres of overgrown land. I thought about selling it sight unseen, but something tugged at me. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was curiosity. Either way, one gray afternoon, I found myself driving down a winding dirt road, the trees pressing in on either side like they wanted to swallow me whole. Um, the house was worse than I expected. Peeling paint, boarded up windows, a sagging porch. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, though the attorney assured me my uncle had lived there until the end. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. I stepped inside, the floor groaning under my weight. The air was thick, and the dim light filtering through the cracks didn't do much to chase away the gloom. I told myself I'd just take a quick look around, see if there was anything worth salvaging, and then get out. The living room was cluttered with old furniture and yellowed newspapers. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at midnight. I found myself staring at it, mesmerized, until Max, my other half, my loyal golden retriever, barked, snapping me out of it. He stood in the doorway to the hall, his ears perked, his body rigid. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but he just growled low in his throat. I chalked it up to the house's weird vibes and moved on, Max reluctantly following at my heels. That's when I found the symbol. It was scratched into the floorboards of the hallway, right in front of a closed door. A circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a sun, but wrong. I crouched down to get a closer look, running my fingers over the grooves. The wood felt cold, colder than it should have. Max whined behind me, and when I glanced back, I saw his fur bristling. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house was full of cracks and crevices, after all. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from behind the door. "Nope, no way," I muttered, standing up. My heart was racing, but I tried to brush it off. Then the whisper turned into a word. "Come." I backed away, nearly tripping over Max. "We're done here," I said out loud, more to myself than to him, but as I turned to leave, I heard a loud thunk. The door behind me had opened. The room beyond was small and empty, save for a single object in the center, a mirror. Its frame was ornate, almost gaudy, with intricate carvings that looked like twisting vines, or maybe snakes. The glass was cloudy, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just dirt or age. It was moving. The surface rippled, like water disturbed by a breeze, and then I saw it, my reflection. Only, it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its eyes were wrong. Dark, hollow. It raised a hand, and so did I, but the movements didn't match. I stumbled back, my breath hitching, but the thing in the mirror smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. "Leave," it said, though its lips didn't move. The voice wasn't mine. I grabbed Max and ran. The hallway seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper, pressing in on either side. I swore I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst outside, the air felt sharp and cold, like I'd surfaced from underwater. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, Max barking the whole way. I never went back. I called the attorney the next day and told him to sell the place, no questions asked. But sometimes, late at night, I see it. The mirror. Not in the house. Here in my own home. Just for a second, out of the corner of my eye, and when I look closer, it's gone. Or maybe it's just waiting. So yeah, that's my story. Take from it what you will, but if you ever inherit a creepy old house, do yourself a favor and burn it to the ground. All right, settle in. This one still messes with me, and I swear it's all true. If you've ever thought about spending the night in the woods, let this be your warning. It started as a simple camping trip. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, drowning in deadlines and late-night emails. I needed a break, and the woods near my hometown seemed like the perfect escape. Quiet, peaceful, away from everything. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my old notebook. I planned to hike out to a spot I remembered from when I was a kid, a small clearing with a view of the river. It was supposed to be relaxing. The hike started off great. The trail was overgrown but manageable, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped in the distance, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above. For the first for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But as I got closer to the clearing, the forest started to change. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. The air felt colder, heavier, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were gone. It was silent. I told myself I was overthinking it. Forests can be weird, right? When I reached the clearing, I almost laughed at how normal it looked. The grass was a little long and the river was lower than I remembered, but it was still the same spot. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the trees weren't as thick and spent the afternoon writing and listening to the water. As the sun started to set, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. The trees were swaying gently, and the sound was faint, almost like a soft hum. But then I realized it wasn't random. The whispers had rhythm, like words spoken too softly to understand. I froze, straining to hear. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness. The whispers stopped. I shook it off, blaming my imagination. I'd been stressed for weeks. Maybe I was just hearing things. But then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night, moving through the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was quick, just a flicker, but it didn't feel right. It was too tall, too thin, and it didn't make a sound. Max, the golden retriever I borrowed from my best friend for the trip, growled low in his throat. His hackles were up, and his eyes were locked on the same spot. "Hey!" I shouted, standing up and grabbing a stick from the fire. "Who's there?" No answer. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I sat by the fire, clutching the stick like it would do anything, and waited. The shadows didn't come back, and the whispers didn't return. By midnight, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I noticed the symbol. It was etched into the ground near my tent, a circle surrounded by jagged lines with something that looked like an eye in the center. I swear it wasn't there when I set up camp. The lines were too sharp, too precise, like they'd been carved with a blade. Max barked suddenly, his body rigid, and I spun around. There, just beyond the firelight, was another shadow. This time, it didn't move. It just stood there, tall and thin, watching. I didn't sleep. The shadow disappeared after a while, but the feeling it left behind didn't. The whispers started up again, louder now, circling the clearing like a sinister chant. Max whimpered, curling up close to me, and I held on to him like a lifeline. The fire burned low, casting flickering light over the trees, and I swore I saw shapes moving in the darkness. Shapes that weren't human. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I packed up my things, grabbed Max, and started back down the trail. But the forest didn't let us go easily. The shadows followed, darting between the trees, just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a maddening chorus. By the time I stumbled back to my car, my hands were shaking, and Max was practically dragging me the last few steps. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers. Not in the forest, here, in my apartment. And when I look into the mirror, I see the symbol carved into the reflection, even though it's not on the glass. It's like the forest didn't stay there. It followed me. So, yeah, if you ever think about camping in a place that feels wrong, don't. Just don't. You ever wake up somewhere you don't remember going to? Not just waking up in a strange bed after a night out. No, I mean truly lost? Like the world forgot you were supposed to be somewhere else? That's what happened to me last October. I still don't know how I got there, and God knows I'll never figure out why. It started with a late-night drive home from my buddy Ryan's place. He lives out in the sticks, and it's a good hour and a half to get back to my apartment in the city. I was tired but sober. I wasn't about to risk driving drunk again after last year's scare. I remember the highway being dead quiet. Just me, my headlights, and the sound of tires humming against the pavement. At some point, I yawned, rubbed my eyes, and when I looked back up, the road was gone. Not like I missed a turn or hit some off ramp I didn't notice. No, the road was just gone. I was on a dirt path surrounded by thick, towering trees. My headlights barely pierced through the branches, and the air felt heavy, damp. I slowed the car down, trying to figure out where I was. My GPS was no help. The screen was blank. Great, I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Real funny, universe. The deeper I drove, the worse it got. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a tangled canopy overhead. The dirt path narrowed until I wasn't sure if my car would fit anymore. But stopping felt worse, like if I stayed in one spot too long, something would find me. Eventually, the path opened up, and I saw it. A house. I should have kept driving. It was an old Victorian-style place, the kind you'd see in a black and white photo labeled haunted. The paint was peeling, the windows dark, and the front door hung slightly ajar. A sign out front read, Hollowbrook Inn, in faded, cracked lettering. I don't know what possessed me to stop. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the hope that someone inside could point me back to the main road. Or maybe it was the faint flicker of light I saw in one of the upstairs windows. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, biting, and the ground squelched beneath my boots. As I got closer to the house, I noticed something strange. There were no sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of mildew and old wood hit me like a wall. The floorboards groaned under my weight and dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the beam of my flashlight. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. No answer. But then I heard it. A faint click-clack, like footsteps on hardwood, coming from upstairs. I froze. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to turn around and never look back, but something kept me there, rooted in place. The staircase was narrow, the wood warped and splintered. Each step groaned louder than the last. By the time I reached the top, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with doors. Most were closed, but one at the far end was slightly open, a faint glow spilling out from inside. I walked toward it, the floor creaking beneath me. My flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows on the walls. When I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On it sat a book, its leather cover cracked and worn. The title was embossed in gold, Guests of Hollowbrook. I flipped it open, and my stomach dropped. The pages were filled with names. Thousands of them, written in a neat looping script. Some were crossed out, others circled. And near the very bottom, in fresh ink, was my name. Evan Carter. My flashlight died. The room plunged into darkness, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and chilling, coming from the hallway. Welcome, Evan. I spun around, fumbling for my phone, but the light wouldn't turn on. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. But the house had changed. The front door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of rotting wood. The whispers surrounded me now, a chorus of voices overlapping, rising into a deafening roar. And then, silence. When I turned around, I saw them. Figures, shadowy and distorted, standing at the edge of the room. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching. I pressed myself against the wall, my hands scrambling for anything, a doorknob, a window, a way out. And that's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. You're one of us now, a voice whispered in my ear. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was in the house, surrounded by those things. The next, I was back in my car, parked on a deserted stretch of highway. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I just drove. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear them. Whispers, faint and chilling, calling my name. And I know deep down that I didn't escape. Not really. Want another? They say you should never take the long road through Ashmore Woods. I always thought it was just a dumb local legend. You know, the kind they make up to scare kids into staying out of the forest. But now, I know better, and I wish to God I'd listened. I was running late, trying to make it to my sister's house for her birthday dinner. The highway was backed up for miles, so I decided to take a shortcut, cut through the woods, shave off 20 minutes. Everyone always warned about that road, said it was bad luck, but I didn't believe in any of that. It was just a road. At first, it was fine. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches intertwining overhead. It felt like driving through a tunnel, the world beyond the woods disappearing entirely. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. But as I drove deeper, the road began to change. The pavement cracked, then turned to gravel, and finally to dirt. My GPS stopped working. The blue dot froze in place, then blinked out altogether. Great, I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The further I went, the darker it got. The canopy above was so dense that even though it wasn't sunset yet, it felt like night. My headlights struggled to cut through the gloom, and the deeper I drove, the more uneasy I felt. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. The car skidded to a stop just a few feet from them. It was a woman, pale, thin, her long dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She was wearing a white dress that looked dirty and torn, like she'd been walking through the woods for days. I rolled down the window, hesitating. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer, just stood there, staring at me. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too wrong, like her mouth stretched farther than it should. Her eyes glinted in the dim light, dark and empty. That was enough for me. I hit the gas, swerving around her, and didn't look back. The road twisted and turned, the trees growing even closer together. My hands were shaking, white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road again. But the road didn't end. It just kept going, winding deeper and deeper into the woods, and then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing among the trees. They were barely visible, just shadows at first. But as my headlights swept over them, I saw their faces. They were pale, hollow, their eyes sunken and lifeless. And they were all watching me. The road narrowed further, forcing me to slow down. The figures got closer, stepping out from the trees, lining the edges of the road. I tried to tell myself they weren't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then one of them stepped directly in front of the car. I screamed, slamming on the brakes again. This time, the car stalled. "No, no, no," I muttered, fumbling with the key, trying to restart it. The figure stood inches from the hood, staring at me. It was a man, his skin as pale as the woman's had been, his mouth twisted into that same too-wide smile. The car wouldn't start. I locked the doors, my breathing ragged. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding the car, their faces pressed against the windows. One of them knocked on the glass, a slow, deliberate tap. "Come out," a voice whispered, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Join us." I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, but then the tapping stopped. The figures were gone. I didn't question it. I didn't wait. The car roared to life on the next try, and I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt as I tore down the road. Eventually, I saw a light ahead, a clearing. The road ended abruptly, dumping me out onto a familiar highway. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just wanted to get away. But when I finally stopped, pulling over at a gas station to catch my breath, I noticed something. The dirt on the car. It wasn't dirt. It was handprints. Hundreds of them, smeared across the windows, the doors, the hood. And when I looked closer, I realized the handprints weren't on the outside. They were on the inside. You ever hear something that sounds so familiar it gives you chills? Like a voice you haven't heard in years calling your name? That's how it started for me. And I wish I'd never answered. It was a Tuesday evening, ordinary as they come. My sister Lily had just moved back to town after 10 years, and we were sorting through some boxes she'd left in our parents' attic. The house was old. Creaky floorboards, drafty windows, but it was home. My childhood memories were wrapped up in every inch of it. Lily and I were laughing about some old yearbooks we'd found when she pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "Do you remember this?" she asked, her voice strangely quiet. I didn't, at first. But when she opened it, my stomach dropped. It was our grandmother's. The thing is, Grandma was strange. kind but distant, like she was always preoccupied with something we couldn't see. She died when I was 11, and honestly, I hadn't thought about her much since. But that journal, its pages were filled with symbols, strange circles, jagged lines, and what looked like words, though none I could understand. Lily turned the pages slowly, her face pale. "She used to take us to that house in the woods," she whispered. "Do you remember?" I did. The house was a crumbling wreck, deep in the forest behind our property. Grandma called it the other place. She'd never let us go inside, but she always left something on the porch: flowers, food, once even a doll. As kids, we thought it was weird. Now, it felt sinister. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Those symbols, the way she'd looked at me when she asked about the house, it was like she knew something she wasn't telling me. The woods were quiet, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. I told myself I was just taking a walk, clearing my head, but my feet carried me to the edge of the trees. And then, before I could think better of it, I stepped inside. The path was overgrown, branches snagging at my clothes. The air smelled damp, like moss and decay. And then I saw it, the house. It was even worse than I remembered, the roof sagging, windows shattered. But the porch was spotless, as if someone had swept it clean. There was something sitting on the step, a bouquet of wilted flowers. I should have turned back. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but then I heard it. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost familiar. It came from inside the house. I froze, my heart hammering. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper, no response, just the creak of floorboards and a shadow. It moved past the broken window, too fast to be anything natural. I don't know why I went inside. Curiosity, maybe? Or something stronger, or something pulling me forward. The air was cold, heavy, and it smelled like damp earth. The walls were covered in those symbols from the journal, scratched deep into the wood. And in the center of the room was a table. On it sat a single object, the same doll Grandma had left on the porch all those years ago. Its head turned toward me slowly. I stumbled back, tripping over the warped floorboards. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, bare, wet, and leading toward the basement door. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a staircase that disappeared into pitch black. "Help me." The voice was louder now, pleading. It sounded like Lily. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my legs felt like lead, but I forced myself down the stairs. The basement was colder, the air thick with the smell of mildew. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. And then I saw her. Lily. Or something that looked like her. She stood in the corner, her back to me. Her hair was wet, dripping onto the dirt floor. "Lily?" My voice cracked. She turned slowly and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were gone. The thing wearing my sister's face smiled, wide and unnatural. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in a voice that wasn't hers. The shadows on the walls moved, crawling toward me like living things. I turned and ran, stumbling up the stairs and out of the house. The woods seemed darker, the trees pressing in on me as I sprinted back to the house. But when I got there, the front door was wide open. Inside, the journal was sitting on the table, its pages blank. And Lily, she was gone. It's been weeks now, and I still hear her voice sometimes, calling me back to the woods. All right. You're not going to believe this, but I swear every word is true. It happened when I went to check on my uncle's old place, a cabin deep in the woods. I thought it'd be simple. Just lock the doors, pick up the mail, and head home. But I've never felt the same since. It had been years since I'd been to the cabin. My uncle loved that place. He always said the isolation was peaceful, that it was his sanctuary. But after he passed, the cabin just sat there, empty. My family had been arguing over what to do with it, and I guess they forgot I lived the closest. So when the pipes burst last winter, they asked me to check things out. I didn't mind. It was only an hour's drive, and honestly, I liked the idea of getting out of the city. A quick trip in, snap some pictures, and leave. Simple. The road to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Twisting, overgrown, barely wide enough for my car. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked wrong. It wasn't the age, though the place was definitely weathered. It was the feeling. The way the windows seemed too dark, the door slightly ajar like it had been expecting me. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot, and that's when I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, not even the hum of insects, just silence. Inside, the cabin smelled like mildew and wood smoke. The furniture was covered in sheets, and dust coated everything in a thin, suffocating layer. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked through, checking the locks and making a list of repairs. But then I found the door. It was in the back corner of the living room, hidden behind an old bookshelf. I'd been in the cabin dozens of times growing up, and I swore there was never a door there before. It was heavy, made of dark wood with strange, shallow carvings. At first, I thought they were scratches, but when I looked closer, they formed a pattern, a circle surrounded by jagged lines. It reminded me of an eye. I shouldn't have opened it, but you know how curiosity works. The hinges groaned as I pulled the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that hit me was damp, cold, and metallic, like rust and earth. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Something about the darkness felt alive, like it was waiting for me to step inside. And then I heard the first whisper. It was faint, almost like a breeze. Come back. The words were barely audible, but they sent chills racing down my spine. I jerked my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely cut through the blackness. Max, my uncle's old dog, who'd somehow outlived him, whined from the doorway. He wouldn't come closer, his ears flat against his head as he stared down the stairs. I should have left right then. I know that. But instead I stepped down. The basement wasn't on any of the cabin's blueprints. It was a small, circular room, the walls lined with more of those carvings. The symbols seemed to twist and shift when I looked at them, like they were alive. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it sat an object I still can't explain. It was a sphere, black as night and smooth like glass. When I shined my flashlight on it, it didn't reflect the light. It absorbed it. And then the whispers grew louder. Take it. The voice was clearer now, deep and echoing, but it wasn't coming from the room. It was inside my head. I backed away, my heart pounding, but my legs felt heavy, like the air in the room was pushing me toward the pedestal. Max barked furiously upstairs, snapping me out of whatever trance I was in. I turned and bolted, slamming the door shut behind me. But the whispers didn't stop. That night, I stayed in the cabin, too scared to drive home in the dark. I barricaded the door with furniture and kept every light on, but it didn't help. The shadows in the room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Shapes moved just beyond the glow of the lamps, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that burned like embers. And then I saw the symbol. It was carved into the inside of my bedroom door, fresh and dripping with something dark. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I grabbed Max, locked the cabin as best I could, and sped home. But the story doesn't end there. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt it. The same cold, damp air from the basement. When I looked toward my closet, the door was open, and inside I saw the eye carved into the wood. And I swear, the whispers haven't stopped since. So, if you ever come across a hidden door, don't open it. No matter how curious you are, some things aren't meant to be found. You ever have a place from your childhood that you're scared to even think about? The kind of place where the air felt heavier, where you just knew you shouldn't be? Yeah, I thought I left mine behind until last week. It started with a funeral. My childhood friend Danny passed suddenly, 34, healthy, no signs of anything wrong. Then, boom, gone. Heart attack, they said. But that didn't sit right with me. Danny was the strongest guy I knew, the one who could run for miles without breaking a sweat. We hadn't talked much since high school, but I still felt like I owed him something. So when his sister asked me to clean out his old place, I said yes. The problem was where Danny lived. Red Hollow. Even the name sounds wrong, doesn't it? Red Hollow. It was this tiny, rundown neighborhood on the edge of nowhere, buried in the woods. When we were kids, it was a ghost town. Most of the houses abandoned and sinking into the dirt. The one place everyone avoided was the old Pritchard house. It was this hulking, rotting beast of a place at the end of the road, hidden behind gnarled trees. No one really knew who built it or why it was still standing. But the rumors, oh man, the rumors. They said people used to live there, whole families that just disappeared without a trace. Kids used to dare each other to knock on the front door, but no one ever made it inside, except Danny. We were 13 when it happened. Danny dared me to go with him, said we'd just peek through the windows, maybe take something to prove we were there. I chickened out at the last second, but Danny went in alone. When he came out, he wouldn't tell me what he saw. He just stopped talking about it altogether. For weeks, he had nightmares, waking up screaming. Eventually, he seemed to shake it off, but he was never the same. And now, here I was, standing on the porch of his house, staring at a key in my hand, and wondering why my stomach felt like it was in knots. Danny's house was as lifeless as the rest of Red Hollow. The inside smelled stale, like something had been rotting for years. His stuff was still there, photos, clothes, even a half-finished dinner on the kitchen table. It was like he'd just stepped out for a moment, but something felt off. The mirrors in the house, they were all covered with black cloths. Every single one. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a superstition, something he picked up after we lost touch. But when I uncovered the first one in the hallway, I regretted it immediately. The glass wasn't reflecting the hallway. I don't know how to explain it. The mirror showed a room I'd never seen before, dark with peeling wallpaper and a single light swinging from the ceiling. And there was something moving in the corner. It was slow at first, just a shadow shifting, but then it stepped into view, a figure, tall and thin, with no face, just a smooth, pale surface where its head should have been. It wasn't looking at me, not at first, but as I stared, its head tilted like it knew I was watching. I threw the cloth back over the mirror and stumbled away, my chest tight with panic. I should have left. I should have walked out, locked the door, and never looked back. But something kept pulling me deeper into the house. I found Danny's bedroom at the end of the hall. It was just like I remembered, posters of old bands, his guitar propped up in the corner. But the desk was covered in notebooks, the pages filled with messy, frantic handwriting. Most of it was nonsense, drawings of strange symbols, ramblings about shadows and whispers. But one phrase kept showing up over and over again. It's in the mirrors. I decided I'd seen enough. Grabbing the notebooks, I headed for the front door, but as I passed the hallway mirror, the cloth slipped off again. This time, the reflection wasn't just the strange room. It was me, standing there pale and trembling. But behind me, it was there. The figure was closer now, its head almost brushing the ceiling. Its long arms hung limply at its sides, but its presence was overwhelming. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, had my breath caught in my throat, and then it whispered my name. The sound snapped me out of my trance. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running to my car. I didn't even look back until I was halfway down the road. When I finally did, the house was dark and still, but I swear I saw something standing in the upstairs window. I burned the notebooks when I got home, but that night I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. In my bathroom, the mirror had shattered, and written in the shards, like someone had dragged a finger through the dust, were 3 words, "You looked back." So yeah, I don't go near mirrors anymore. And if you're ever in Red Hollow, do yourself a favor, don't go near the Pritchard house. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in anything supernatural. That was until I walked into that house. It started with a simple phone call. A friend of mine, Alex, asked me to help clean out his aunt's house. She just passed away, and there was no one else to do it. The house was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees and a road that hadn't seen much traffic in years. I didn't mind, though. I'd always enjoyed a bit of peace and quiet. Plus, Alex was a good guy, and I owed him a favor. So I agreed to drive out there, and the next morning, I found myself on a winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. The air was thick, damp, like it hadn't seen the sun in days. When I arrived, the house was exactly as I expected, old, faded, and quiet. The kind of place that had seen better days, but still carried that old-world charm. It was the kind of house that made you think twice about entering, though. I'll admit, as I stood there on the porch, staring at the chipped paint and creaky steps, I had the urge to turn back, but I didn't. Alex wasn't there yet. He was stuck at work, so it was just me, alone with the house. The front door creaked open easily, like it was welcoming me in, Inside, the place smelled like dust and something else, something like rotting wood. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and old furniture sat covered in white sheets, like the house was waiting for its owners to come back. I moved slowly, checking the rooms one by one. There was an odd silence that hung in the air, the kind that feels too thick. I walked into the living room, and that's when I noticed it. A large mirror on the wall, framed in dark wood, stood out against the dreariness of the room. There was something about it, though. It felt wrong. The reflection wasn't quite right. I could see myself in it, but the edges of my reflection were blurred, almost as if the mirror was struggling to capture the image of me, like it didn't quite want to. I looked away, shaking the feeling off, and went to work. I started sorting through boxes in the next room, trying to find anything that might be useful. But I kept hearing it. Whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the air was still. Then I thought it might be the house settling, but these whispers weren't like anything I had heard before. They seemed personal. They were too clear to be the wind, too deliberate to be a draft. Help me. I froze. The whisper was soft but distinct, and it came from the hallway. My heart jumped. I was alone. Wasn't I? I stood there, straining my ears, but the whisper never came again. I tried to shake it off and keep working. I wasn't one to scare easily, but the more I moved through the house, the more I noticed strange things. In the kitchen, there was a chair that faced away from the table, yet it was pulled out as though someone had just been sitting there. In the guest bedroom, the curtains were pulled back, but there were fingerprints on the window, dark smudges like someone had been staring out. The windows were dirty, sure, but these marks were fresh. I was beginning to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. By the time Alex finally showed up, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. I could barely keep my composure. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, noticing my tension. I didn't want to tell him about the whispers, about the cold feeling creeping up my spine, so I just nodded. We worked in silence for a while, moving boxes around, clearing out shelves, until Alex found something strange in the attic. A box that had been shoved in the farthest corner, buried under a pile of old books. It was sealed shut, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, there were several old photographs and journals, along with a strange carved symbol that was drawn over and over in the pages. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, twisted, jagged, and haunting. We decided to leave the box unopened for now, and Alex suggested we take a break. That's when it happened. As we sat down in the living room, I noticed the mirror again. This time, I couldn't stop staring at it. My reflection wasn't just blurry anymore, it was moving. The image of me sitting there on the couch began to twist, almost like it was melting, the features shifting and contorting. But that wasn't the worst part. There was someone else standing behind me, a figure, a woman. Her face was a pale blur, but I could see the outline of her long dark hair and the shape of her hands as she reached toward me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. The room was empty. The only sound was the thudding of my own heartbeat. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that whisper, the voice calling me. Help me. It wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from inside, from the walls, from the mirror. It felt like it was in my head, whispering over and over until I thought I was losing my mind. The next morning, I couldn't leave fast enough. Alex was busy dealing with some of the other items in the house, and I couldn't face going back upstairs, not with that mirror still hanging there, watching me. I haven't been able to forget what happened. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. Help me. It's like the house still has a hold on me, even though I left it behind. But the worst part, the thing that haunts me, when I saw that mirror, the reflection I saw wasn't just mine. It was someone else's, someone I didn't recognize, someone with my face. You ever have one of those moments where you wonder if the world you know is real? Because right now, I can't help but feel like I'm still stuck in that house. And I swear, every time I look in a mirror, I see her watching me.